Great, thank you. So I'm very happy to introduce our next speakers from the Aspen Institute. Keith Witham, Deputy Director of the College Excellence Program, and Josh Wyner, Vice President of the Aspen Institute and Founder and Executive Director of the College Excellence Program.
Great. Thanks for making the time. I'm really excited by what you're doing. I have spent the last 20, 25 years building new things. And there's nothing more rewarding than building a new thing and having an impact. And knowing that what you're doing can help literally hundreds of thousands of students in your state. I mean, that's a remarkable opportunity. And the good news is that if you do it well and get some wins and really succeed, you're going to be able to keep reinventing it. Because community colleges are incredibly complex institutions. I mean, even the definitions that we have today of what student success is and that you have in your states, my guess is are going to change over time. And the strategies for doing the work are going to emerge over time. And each of you are starting in different places and you'll learn things from other folks. So this can be constantly renewing. So as a startup, it's not a 2-year startup, it's a startup as long as you want. And if it doesn't succeed, well, there's full employment. So, no, I'm joking. No, I'm really excited by that, and it's just incredibly rewarding to start something new. So why are we so focused on leadership at the Aspen Institute? So we started the program just 7 or 8 years ago, and we started with the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence that some of you may have heard of. And after the first couple of cycles, we noticed something really important, which is that the colleges that were succeeding had presidents who had been there for a long time. And so one reason we focused on leadership is just that recognition. They've been there for a long time. I also met soon thereafter one of the senior people at the Department of Education who went down into the bowels of the Department of Education and said, I'm going to try to find the student success stuff that's in the FIPSE reports. You all know FIPSE, right? And he went into the bowels, he spent weeks in them, and he found one common element in all of the evaluations of those reports. It was that institutional leadership was what resulted in strong levels of student success. And we have a system of higher ed, of community colleges, that no matter what happens at your state level, the institutions still, by and large, have control over what programs they offer, right? There's some approval processes, but by and large, the faculty work on the curriculum, and the advisors decide what the advising model is going to be. It's not decided by a Ministry of Education, either at the federal or the state level, as it is in some other countries. So leadership really deeply matters. I think the other reason that we're so focused on it is because of the enormous opportunity right now. So the average age of a college president has gone from 52 to 62, 61 or 62, in just 20 years, right? How many people think that we're living 10 years longer than we did 20 years ago? Right? No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is we've got an aging college presidency. And what that means is that people are leaving at more rapid rates, but the more important thing is that when they leave, they're retiring. And it's because we have this boom in community colleges, and a lot of young people entered the presidency, and they're leaving now. And the interesting thing is that the chief academic officers that are right behind them, they're leaving too. They're only a year younger, on average, than presidents. And so we've got this amazing opportunity to think about how will we foster leadership development. And the answer has to be at the state level. We can't continue to think of this as board by board and institution by institution. And there's no way that this is going to be a federal priority. The place where it can happen is at the state level. And why? It can happen at the state level because you've got a series of presidents who all are under the same governance structure. Sometimes they report to the same person, as in Virginia. And sometimes they report to the elected board, so they have that commonality. They have the same requirements vis-a-vis four-year partners. They have the same funding structure. They have a reason to communicate, and they do communicate. How many of you have regular presidents' meetings in your states for presidents? Right? How many people think those are primarily or even substantially about student success? Right? I mean, think of that as an opportunity. think of the opportunity. We have an infrastructure. We often think about new meetings like this one. You have infrastructures to do this work in your state. So this is really exciting. I am absolutely convinced that you all and your partners at the state level are the conduit to exceptional leadership and the continuity of guided pathways and other student success reforms that are needed. So what we want to do today is have a conversation about what are the qualities that leaders have that enable high levels of student success. And then we're really going to zero in on internal change leadership. We'll talk about this a little bit, but there are really two sides of leadership that are needed, and we see them as really very different in process. One is the external work that needs to be done to partner with K-12, four-year colleges, businesses, community-based organizations, even the state legislature, governor, right? There's partnership that needs to be done at the leadership level, and we're really going to focus today on internal change leadership. We're in conversation about how we might do something on the external side as well. And then really want to figure out how that gets applied in your student success work. So we're going to have some interactive things that we'll go through today, exercises to try to lead through these three. These are sort of the three topics for today. So after the first couple of cycles of the prize, as I mentioned, we noticed that transformational leadership, institutions that saw really high and dramatically improving levels of student success had leaders who had been there a long time who were really effective. And then we started looking into the leadership literature about what were the qualities of leadership. And we saw a lot of reference to John Cotter. Anybody hear about that talked about? Which felt like the closest thing. References to Good to Great, Jim Collins, a lot of business literature, but nothing that actually spoke in a deep way. The best work probably was Adriana Kazar and Peter Eckel, and we've used some of that for those who know their research, but nothing that sort of talked about leadership for student success, right, in the college environment. And so we decided to do our own research in partnership with Achieving the Dream, and we combed through Achieving the Dream data. We found the 10 colleges that had seen the most rapidly improving levels of student success in the first several years of Achieving the Dream's work. And then we took the top 5 placers in the Aspen Prize competition. And we interviewed those 14 presidents, not 15 because Valencia was on both lists and we had a protocol that we were using. And we tried to figure out what were the qualities of these exceptional presidents. And we then held it up against the qualities that we saw being taught in PhD, EDD programs on leadership and in non-traditional programs by AACC. And then we held it up against a series of interviews we did with search consultants on what's valued in the search process, right? So on the one hand, we're trying to find out what are the qualities of exceptional presidents, and we want to hold it up against what boards of trustees value in the hiring process, told to us through headhunters, and what was being taught at the time. And the result of that was this report called Crisis and Opportunity, which all of you have had a chance to read. Don't raise your hands. If you're anything like me, sometimes it gets done, sometimes it doesn't. But what we found was that there were 5 qualities of exceptional leaders, and that those were not necessarily the things that were being sought by boards of trustees, and that there were big gaps between what was being taught in EDD programs and non-traditional programs, right? These smaller programs, and what were those qualities? So, what are the 5 qualities of exceptional presidents? And I don't think these are actually that surprising, although as a bundle, it's an interesting question, and we're going to ask you in a moment to reflect, preview, on which of these you see more frequently and less frequently. So can folks see the slides? The contrast isn't quite as good. Deep commitment to student access and success. This was the first thing that emerged, was this kind of deep commitment, almost praying on the altar of student access and success, right? This was, I don't know how else to say it, but I did the vast majority of these interviews. It was a religious thing for folks. It was the reason they did their work. And the reason this mattered so much is not just because you pursue the endeavor of improving student success, but there are a lot of other things that can keep you busy. So a president can be 24/7 without focusing on student success. There's no doubt about that. That's number one. Number two, there are excuse me, there are cultural norms that have to be pushed through, and it's uncomfortable to do. And if you don't believe in this, the counterweight of wanting things to go well and worrying a little bit about your job and your future could overwhelm that. This is the counterweight. And the third reason is precisely what I was mentioning earlier, which is how long you stay at the college. If you are really good at what you do and you're not deeply committed to student access and success, when the call comes for a better college at a bigger salary with more students and a higher profile, guess what you do? You jump. You jump after 3 or 4 years. One of the reasons these folks were staying was not because they didn't have other opportunities. We asked that question. The majority did, and it was believable. They were staying because the job wasn't done. They were staying because the reason they did the work went well beyond their own personal aggrandizement and their role and the sense that this was the next role. And look, you can't be a college president without believing in yourself and believing that you deserve more opportunity. This isn't to say these people were all completely selfless. You know, the vast majority of them were earning great salaries, and so I'm not suggesting that they were, you know, giving of themselves, and you know, but it was really striking. Pardon? It's not. Right. It's not all altruism. Some of it is, though. Second, a willingness to take strategic risks, significant risks to advance student success. Stories about significant risks. If you ask that question of many presidents, not sure it really is the kind of risk we're talking about, but you heard stories about shutting down the gym, about taking on the union and disbanding the union. I'm not saying these are good things to do, but they were what they saw as needed at the moment. Closing major programs, right? I mean, major things that were done. Putting different people at the center of the, really strategically, of the faculty union and the faculty leadership to usher in a new tenure system. I mean, these were really taking risks that if they got that when people heard about them, they'd worry about, and sometimes very visible risks. Ending enrollment reports. You're no longer allowed to have reports on enrollment to try to slay, that's, you know, Sandy Sugar, try to slay enrollment, right? People were calling up. That was the coin of the realm. Everybody defined their success with enrollment reports. Sandy said, you can't deliver them anymore. Moratorium for a year. That was risky. People were screaming about it. I want my enrollment report. So risks. Third, ability to create lasting change within the college. This encompasses a lot of stuff. I think it's an understanding that college reform needs to happen strategically. You need to understand the balance between urgency and patience. You need to understand when to light the flame, in the words of Linsky, who's written about this, right? When to turn the flame up and when to let things simmer down. It's understanding where the power centers are on campus. It's understanding how you need everybody to understand urgency. We'll talk a little bit about this later. Everybody's got to have common goals and what that looks like and how long it takes to help everybody see themselves in the reform because they were part of creating the reform. That internal change ability is probably, in terms of the abilities of presidents, the most telling one because it really isn't easy. These are decentralized institutions where there's a lot of power. There are a lot of power centers throughout the institution, and it's hard to keep your eye on all of that and understand where all of it's moving and be able to iterate and strategically move the institution forward. Fourth, capacity to build strong external partnerships aligned to student success goals. Every president that I know who lasts is good at some external communications and some external partnerships. What distinguished these folks was who their partners were with and how they envisioned the partnership. So they really saw partnerships with K-12, with four-year colleges, with employers, community-based organizations. Those were the four that emerged most. And they saw those partnerships as essential to enabling students to succeed. Not to getting resources for the college, but to enabling students to succeed. So if that meant that students needed to leave after their first year in order to go to a four-year school, or in order to get a good job, and students were doing that, trying to create structures at the college that enabled that to happen. Not thinking, if that meant working with K-12 and dedicating resources to K-12 to prevent the need for remediation for developmental ed, they were doing that hard work. And so you saw this kind of, the external work, again, that alone can take up 24/7 of your time. You go to the Lions Club, you go to the legislature, you go to the governor's office, you go to all of the chicken dinners that you have to go to, right? And this is what presidents have to do, but there was this kind of intentionality, and it was, where are students coming from, and where are they going? Where do they come from, and where do they go? They come from community-based organizations in K-12, and they go to four-year colleges and employers. That's where our partnerships have to be. So that was the clearest expression of that. And finally, we cheated a little because we didn't want to have 6, the ability to raise and allocate resources in ways aligned to student success goals. This isn't cheating in the way that resources really were fundamentally thought about as the way to get the work done, but also aligning the institution to student success goals. So this was, in the words of many of the presidents, the greatest power they had was right here, allocating resources. And they also said that they were surprised that so many of their peers were reluctant to use that power, that they didn't understand it fully and were reluctant to use it. So these were the 5 qualities that we saw. And now we want to ask you the question, what do you see in your state? So if you were to identify where these are most and least likely, what would you say? I know lots of presidents who have you talk to them and there is it really is, and it's personal, deep commitment to student access and success. And when it comes to taking risks and doing something about it and understanding what to do, maybe not quite as much, right? And vice versa. I see others who are churning and doing activities that might be related to that, building partnerships. So I actually think you can have any one of these more commonly. The other is that this is relative, right? Which is the most common in your view? So this is interesting. So we've got people who are deeply committed to the work, but not as capable of doing it. And when they do it, it looks like money and partnerships. Not in that order, right? The external work is the place where they're focusing their energy. But this is really interesting. The risk-taking and the internal change are not the things that anybody sees as most frequent. Now, you may think all of these are, I'm not going to ask the question, but you may think all of these are incredibly present among all leaders in your state, and this was relative. But I suspect you may see some of these things as lacking. So why is it, do you think? This is a really important point that came through in our research, was that one of the things that they said almost to a person was that you have to spend equal amounts of time inside and outside the institution, and that far too many, and this was from big colleges too, where I expected it to be, where they felt, but the attention had to be equal. Even at big colleges where the time maybe couldn't be equal, the attention had to be equal. And they felt that that was just not the case typically, that typically presidents were, by and large, on average, spending more time externally. Terrific point. So again, this is an interesting question, which is, if this is the greatest need, I mean, it makes sense that that's what's least done, and this is the greatest need. I mean, we'll talk a little bit later about what can the strategies be for getting here. But how many people believe, anybody want to suggest that you've got opportunities for presidents in these areas? So if the need is great, are there things to build on there? Just reflect a little bit about that, I think. And why that gap? Why, if it's the greatest need? And by the way, the same pattern exists every time we put up these slides. I hate to have you all feel like you're not special. You didn't surprise me, but that's actually a good sign. It means that the more subjective views overlap, the more likely they are to be objective. It's objectively true. Why is that? That if the greatest need is here, the least is being done there? Well, thank you all. I mean, this has been really both affirming, but also, I think, interesting. And if we move on, we're going to talk a little bit about strategy, and I'm going to engage you in a conversation a little bit on how you're thinking about doing this work. But let's move to the next slide. So how can Student Success Centers support building strong leadership capacity across the state? So how do you think about doing this work? And I'd actually like Cynthia Farrell. So we've done some work across the country. We've done some work in California and Virginia and Michigan a little bit. But I've really been impressed by Cynthia and how she's thinking about it. And I just thought it might be helpful to hear from one of your, can I say brethren? Is that right? How do you say this? Sisterhood. All right. About how you're thinking about it, because I've been really impressed with the work you've done. Every state that we've worked with that I mentioned has been doing terrific work in some areas, and it really depends on you and the folks in the state to try to define what that is. What are people ready for? So when we think about the goals, we think about it in 3 or 4 buckets, and I'm going to put 3 of them up, but the last one, which I think Cynthia alluded to, we don't have up here largely because it's not something we're offering, but I'll make reference to it. So one is getting the right people into presidencies. So when you think back to that problem of people who aren't committed to student success, can you train for that? Maybe. If you show people data and they've never seen it before, maybe they get religion on that and they want to do something about it. If they're not taking strategic risks and unwilling to take strategic risks, can you train for that? Maybe. But on those fronts, it may be that the work needs to happen in terms of who's in the jobs. Now you might say, whoa, I don't want to be picking presidents. Well, you don't pick presidents, but boards pick presidents, or your chancellors pick presidents. And there are processes through which you can engage to better align that hiring with student success goals, with these qualities. We've developed some hiring tools, thanks. And by the way, Kresge was the funder of the original crisis and opportunity research and these hiring tools that we've developed. And we've now worked with a number of people, including on the California Chancellor's search, on the Rhode Island Community College President's search, and on a number in Michigan, California, Texas, and some other places. We've worked to support some of these using hiring tools. We're not going to talk about that in detail today, but boards can be trained new ways of doing hiring, and you can have an impact on that. It's a little tricky, because if there's a sitting president when you're training people, what's the message? Why are you training them to hire a new president when I'm in the job now? So I'm not saying that it doesn't have to be handled carefully, but statewide training of trustees, and Chris saw the Michigan work, which I thought was some of the most engaged work and led to some searches there. So that's one thing to think about, which is how do we have an impact? Now remember, anybody know in your state, what the average tenure of a community college president is? 3 years in? 3 years in California. Anybody else? Do you know the answer to that? Might be worth knowing. What is it nationally? Anybody know? It's 5-ish. 5-ish. Anybody know? Anybody have a sense as to if you're really starting a student success trajectory, how long it takes to really have that take hold? Anybody have 5 years, 8 to 10 years? So if it's 5 years, which is the shortest that I've heard, and I agree you can do it, if it's 5 years and 5 years is the average tenure, that means half the time you're not going to have somebody who's going to be able to stick around doing the job. In fact, more than half the time, because you're going to have that. I can't do the math. But you get the idea, right? If the average tenure is 5 years and it's 5 years to see it really take hold, and if the new president comes in and doesn't have a common framework, that's challenging. Second, you've got to ensure that there's a strong bench of leaders within the state. Leading from the middle is a terrific example of that. It's done in California. Bob Gabriner and the RP group have done great work on leading from the middle. Hugely important. But that bench is to fuel the presidency in the future, but it also can be to fuel deanships and other more senior roles within the institution. So what can you do there? And then finally, developing current president's skill in change leadership, right? Now there's one more, and this is something that my colleague Alison Cadlick has done quite a bit, and we talk about with some frequency, which is actually developing the skills within the institution to project management. Melinda Karp's IPASS report on leadership, if you haven't read it, it's worth reading, because she talks about the need for senior leadership and project leadership and the qualities of both that are needed to see a project like IPASS move forward. I think it's really terrific. And that work can be done, if you think about that as a fourth bullet here. But I think even here with current presidents, if they don't understand the need for developing leadership through the institution, it's not going to happen. So you can even think about developing leadership through the institution as a presidential awareness issue. And then they develop the resources needed to do that internally. So when you think about this, you've reflected a little bit on where you see strengths and where you see challenges. I'd like you each just to take a moment and reflect on where you have strategies or where you think you might want to develop strategies that might advance any or all of these goals. What would your priorities be in your state? Worth just thinking for a moment, and I want you to reflect, and anybody who'd like to share, great, but really, just want you to take a moment and take a note on where you think you might want to engage based on the history of your state, what's happening in your state, what the infrastructure is, who the partners might be, but also reflecting back to what you saw, right? What's most common and what's most needed in terms of capacities. As I mentioned, we didn't see at Aspen a great developed literature on what's needed. And we really saw internal and external change leadership as important. We're going to be focusing here today, but this is equally important, and this is the definition of excellent external partnerships. Now, for those of you who actually read geeky stuff like collective impact literature, that's what this is. And when researchers have looked across cities and other large partnerships that have seen great success, they've found that these are the 5 things that define really strong partnerships across organizations. When we looked at it, felt like it really defined strong one-to-one partnerships. And so we can find time to talk about that and to think about training. We've got training on this, though, and at the end of this, Keith is going to lead you through a process of looking at the curriculum that we've built. But, for instance, identifying a common agenda and shared vision for change requires that you start by thinking about the other person. A lot of presidents come in thinking, I want to get X out of this meeting. Wrong way to start it. The question is, what does this person care about that overlaps with what I need and what I need for my students and for my institution? And helping presidents understand that, there are exercises. We've got a terrific curriculum writer named Millicent Bender who really can lead people through simple exercises. And so one of our goals today is going to be to lead you through some exercises on this side so you can see what that feels like, so you actually have a sense as you're thinking about developing your own work as to how this curriculum might help. But just know that on this side, it's been quite effective in our fellowship and other contexts where we used it. But we really, today, are going to focus over here. Okay, so these are the 5 elements of leading internal change that we've identified as critical, along with strategic communications. Here are the questions that we want you to ask. And there's a handout. Has anybody found the handout in your binder? Rather, in your folder. It's the last thing, I think, on the right-hand side. So many of these questions are there. So in today's work, we're really thinking about training the trainer, right? Whether you're the trainer or there are presidents in your state or others who can do leadership development work, or you want to work with us, but thinking about how you're going to enable leadership development in your state. We're going to focus more on that than on the hiring side. But there's another question, which is, what are the lessons from this of what effective presidents do on their college campuses to your work as a state student success leader? So we're asking you to do something a little complicated here, which is think about how you deliver services, but also think about your own behavior and your own capacity to lead change within your institutions. So these are the questions, and they're in your folder that we'd like you to be thinking about. What exists right now? What could you be doing to run a session like this? So let's get right into it. So what kind of change are we talking about? So guided pathways really is transformational change. It's the textbook definition of transformational change, and this comes from work of Peter Eckel and his colleagues at ACE when he was there. Transformational change he defined in 4 places. It alters the culture of the institution by changing select underlying assumptions and institutional behaviors, processes, and products. It is very much about culture. It's deep and pervasive, affecting the whole institution. It's intentional. It doesn't happen because of outside forces only. Outside forces can trigger the need for it and can influence it. WeEd is focused on student access and success. That's not Peter Eckel. And then it occurs over time. Transformational change does not happen in a moment. So when we looked at all of the literature and interviewed lots of folks and built a curriculum, we had actually support from the Gates Foundation as part of the Guided Pathways initiatives. We brought multiple focus groups together to talk through it. This is what we found. And some of this builds on Cotter, but some of it's really quite different. These are the 5 things internally that are done. Communicate a vision and create urgency. We're going to be talking about that. Build college-wide ownership for change. Align structures and resources. Build a system to support disciplined execution. You do not see this in the literature on corporations. And our hypothesis of that is that they tend to be more unitary. The more complex they get, I think the harder it is to have focused and disciplined execution. But disciplined execution in decentralized organizations becomes harder, which is what colleges are. And then finally, establish routines of inquiry and evidence use. And throughout, create routines of effective communication. That is important through all of this. So these are the 5 things that we're trying to teach folks how to do. So how do transformational leaders build urgency? Well, one is they share data. They cherry pick data that are important. And they share those data, and and I say cherry pick, and you may say, whoa. But in essence, they're looking through all of the data and they're asking, what are the things that seem to really matter? They have to have some vision. And if people want to add data sets and those data sets don't work, they probably need to test those before really sharing them broadly. But I think the question is, do the data relate to outcomes that, if improved, would lead to students' ultimate goals? The data should relate to graduation, to job placement, to transfer and baccalaureate attainment to a better life. Right? Ultimate goals. They can't be too micro. Number 2, they have to elicit a no response to the question, is this okay? Is it okay that 78% of our students don't get a degree? Is that okay? Right? Third, it includes some indicators of trends that can be changed in a reasonable period of time. You need to have some leading indicators. Some component, the flip side to the ultimate goal is you got to have something that people can see changing in the shorter run. Fourth, that they inspire action rather than blame. This is largely in the telling of the story. It can't be, we've failed on this. It can't be if it's all downward trends and people see themselves in it, and it's explained that way. So this is really important. And then finally, draw attention to institutional responsibility rather than student deficits. Are the data easy to understand? So what are a couple of things that I use because I find powerful in my work? Well, here are 2 things. Building urgency around why this matters. So this is a chart in this area of how many people are below poverty by race, ethnicity, and age. And overall, it's 16.4%. 40% of African American children in the Seattle-Tacoma area are living in poverty, who are under 5 years old. They're children under 5 living in poverty. 32% of Latinos are living in poverty. 30% of Native Americans are living in poverty. Children under 5. So that's despair, right? How can we live with that? I'm not blaming anybody, but wow, is that okay? It doesn't answer all the questions. And then here's another chart, which is, actually there's one more chart here that we don't have, which is the correlation between getting a degree and climbing out of poverty. There's a second chart there. Clear correlation by race, for every race. If you get a college degree, you're out of poverty. Your chances of being out of poverty are much higher. So I've got 2 things. And then here's a third one that's really compelling that comes from Georgia, which is if you attempt 9 hours in your focus area, this is to CCRC's research, 9 hours in your focus area in your first year, your chances of graduating more than double, whether you finish them or not. So how can we not want to do this? How can we not want to lift people out of poverty? There's a story in those charts. there's a story. And this doesn't lay blame, but it's very clear, and it raises the question, then, if you start looking at our students, what questions would it raise for you? Who does that and who doesn't do it? Why? How can we get more to do it? So it's raising these questions. So these are just examples. Second, activate the student voice. There are 3 ways we've seen to do this: focus groups, student surveys, and secret shopper programs. But activating the student voice matters. The best story I've heard about this, one of the best stories, is at Miami-Dade Community College, where there was real resistance to creating guided pathways, to just creating the very pathways, because a lot of faculty said, but students can't explore. Students are going to, right? Nobody's heard that, right? Students can explore. And anybody know the story about what happened next? They heard it so much and they wanted to respond that they basically took over 30 class periods, and they had the professor sitting there and somebody else asking questions and somebody else taking notes, all faculty and advisors. And they asked them the question: if you could have a structured program, what would you think? Would you like that or not? What's frustrating to you about course selection? Just give me the courses I want. I'm wasting my time and money. They heard it over and over and over again, whether it was in developmental education or in their honors program even, which is more structured. They were hearing some of these same things over and over. And so they activated the student voice, right? Allison, were you part of that work in Miami-Dade? I know you did some work on there. With CBD, yeah, completion by design, but it was all about that. And it flipped the conversation. They activated the student voice. So it created a sense of urgency and did away with a form of resistance. And then again, telling a human story. I think, we've moved, we're so tired of planning by anecdote that we say we've got to use data and you need to be data-driven. But don't forget to tell a human story. Let a human tell their story. Tell a story of a student. An individual story can go a long way. Don't let that drive everything, because if that one student was the most successful student in the history of the college, that's not going to be the right story necessarily. It can be inspiring, but tell a human story. So the question for you is, how can you build that? Are there any lessons here that anybody would like to reflect on in terms of building urgency in the state? Do you think you've got urgency across your state for improving student success change? And are there any lessons here about what you might be able to do? Do you have commonly shared data across your state that people feel is relevant to them? Are you adequately activating the student voice? Are you finding ways to ensure that institutions activate the student voice so that people in the institutions hear the student voice regularly? This is very powerful. It's one of the most powerful things you can do. I can argue with you all day long about whether guided pathways are fine, but if there's a student sitting there saying, telling you about how they moved on to a 4-year college and they took all the wrong courses and nobody was available, or even worse, they were the ones they were told to take, how do you say, no, we shouldn't fix that? Right? Or I say, we shouldn't fix that. We can argue all day long about what's right, but the student trumps all. It's very hard to argue with the student experience. So think a little bit about that. So routines of effective communication. We're going to move to an exercise in just a moment. Here are the 6 things that we see that are done to create routines of effective communication. It's really important, and Rob Johnstone talks about this all the time, to create time and space to discuss the data and the student voice. The data are not self-explanatory, but the other thing is the data raise the questions, they don't give you the answers. And if people don't have a chance to process the data and really talk about what the meaning of the data is, what the cause of the data are, the causes of the data that they're seeing are, it's very unlikely they're going to really interpret them in a way that changes action. Clear language, leading the college in dialogue. Guided pathways is great language, but you may have your own. But that language, and using the same language over and over again that stands for something, can be incredibly important. You've got to build a team of champions for change. The president can't do it alone. There's got to be a team of champions for the change that work through the institution. You have to have forums to communicate. You have to use every vehicle. It's not just words, it's actions, it's videos, it's every vehicle you can. And then finally, modeling the vision through how time and money are spent. The way you allocate money is actually a form of communication. When people see money move, there's no better way to communicate what the values of the institution are. There's so much to unpack there, I think. I think this notion of building a team of champions for change, sometimes it can be the ones who are there, sometimes you got to move roles around, sometimes you have to consolidate things. So I think that structure that you're talking about, that's one way to think about it. And in our research, we actually had a hypothesis that human capital mattered deeply, and we couldn't find anything common. Some people arrived at colleges and they picked the people who were most likely to reform and they ran with them. They let everybody just sort of stay where they were. Others listened for 3 months and then restructured. Others listened for 6 months and then invited half the people to submit their resignations in the senior team. And it really was hard to figure out, but I think you're right. I do think it really matters, and there was an intentionality around that. I think the other, though, is just naming it. I mean, I think when we hire presidents, we don't think of risk-taking as something that matters. We, in fact, think that getting along matters deeply. That's the thing that matters the most. Can they get along with everybody? Think about that. If you're looking for somebody who gets along with everybody, how likely are you to pick somebody who's a risk-taker? Seems like opposite. Doesn't mean that they can't come in the same package. But and the other thing we care about is fiscal stability when we hire people. Again, if you want fiscal stability, are you going to end late registration if that means you might have a dip in enrollment for a little period of time before things... No! I need fiscal stability, right? So I think if we can name some of these things, I think there are a lot of people who are coming up through the ranks or who are new presidents who might feel safe to do it. And it really is important that the board be brought along, to Cynthia's point. Because, and then within the institution, it has to be safe, as you say. It has to be safe to do this work. You have to actually be applauded for doing the work. And I think it's the same question for the president on his staff. What is the culture of the staff? How do you create that same, if you work hard and try something and it fails, is that okay? If you say we're not as good as we thought we were, if you point to student success failures, challenges, are you okay? Or are you a naysayer who is viewed as trying to burn down the institution? Right? So I think that matters within the institution too. How can you use these strategies? Again, thinking about these strategies at the state level. I'd like you to take out the form and think a little bit about who does this most effectively in your state. Think about a president or another leader in higher ed, or maybe even outside of higher ed. But who does this really well? Who communicates really well? And is there some way you could leverage them in your state? How do you use their success? How can you know? Do you know who's doing this well? And how else is this relevant to your practice as a leader? Think again about your own practice. How can you help elevate risk-taking behavior, or strong communications, data sharing, clarity about shared goals?
So one of the strategies that we often use is this, the idea of a Dear Abby letter, where we write up, and many of these that are in the curriculum came from presidents that have been part of our fellowship, that have been mentors in our fellowship program, helping us describe sort of what is a common dilemma that they've encountered. And we've written them up in this format called a Dear Abby letter, and we have teams work together, read these letters, and then craft responses. And so if you look in your handout, on page 4, pages 4 and 5 actually, there's 3 examples of these. And there's a lot of these embedded in the curriculum and our curricular resources throughout the different modules that we've built. But we'd be curious to just have you spend a minute now at your tables and look at letter A, Dear Change Leadership Guru, please help, exclamation point. I suspect that what's presented here in this dilemma will resonate with you, especially if you've spent time working on a campus and doing guided pathways work. But spend some time reading this and talking a little bit about how this might resonate with you in your own work and how you've seen this, and then also how you might use this kind of format as a teaching tool. And so spend some time talking about that, and then we'll come back together and share that out a little bit. I'm guessing this may sound familiar to many of you. Talk a little bit about, share out, if anyone's willing, what you see as the real problem here, what's being reflected in this dilemma. So Sandy Shugart always says, when we teach this in the fellowship, Sandy Shugart from Valencia College always says, people don't fear change, they fear loss. People don't fear change, they fear loss. And I heard some great conversation over here about that, the sense of identity that faculty have in their craft and in their practice, and that's not always reflected in when we talk about guided pathways and structures, and like where is my practice as a faculty member in a structure, right? Like that's not what I do. So what can the president do in this case, right? What can the president do to help better engage, meaningfully engage, right? And I've learned from Allison to stop saying get buy-in. It's not buy-in. We don't want buy-in. We want engagement. So how can the president get engagement, help really engage faculty to see their own identities in pathways, and to build urgency, and to help them see that what they do actually does connect to student outcomes? The pre-mortem analysis asks you to look pre-mortem analysis.
So this is something that actually is common in hospitals. When there's complicated surgery, the team will get together and they'll say, if the patient dies on the table, what happened? And then you plan for everything to prevent that from happening. But it's a very powerful exercise to get everybody to surface this idea that things are going to go wrong. And it's okay to object. We want to hear what could go wrong, and then to plan ahead of time. And too often we take the next step moving forward. So it's been adopted by others in business settings, and a couple of presidents we know have adopted this for their campuses. And it's a very powerful tool to enable people who otherwise might feel like naysayers to actually come forward with what the problems are beforehand and use them in a constructive way, right? So it really surfaces the things that people know in practice are going to happen because they've seen it happen over and over and over again. The thing isn't going to work. But nobody wants to hear the person raise their hand and say, this is a stupid idea. So there's a pre-mortem analysis. So it's a way of creating that. So we want you to engage in that. You have 10 minutes. And we've given you a sample goal if you want to use that. If you don't have a statewide goal right now, it might be an increase of 25% over current baseline of students who complete a credential of no more than 66 credits in no more than 3 calendar years. So pick a date certain in the future. But you may have a statewide goal for student success, right? 55 by 25, or I don't know, you all got these numbers that I swim in my head. I can never match them to the state. We should do that sometime. That would be a fun Jeopardy exercise. Right? Match the number to the state. I don't think any of us could do it. So take 10 minutes with the table and assume 5 years from now you didn't reach your goal. What's the likely cause of mortality if you don't reach the goal? And if you want to adopt this one for 5 years from now, a 25% over baseline. So, right, if you're at 20%, you'll be at 25% then, right, if you're at, you got it? So you can choose that one or choose your own. What specifically might happen to derail the effort? And for each cause, what strategies might you employ? There's a sheet that you can use to fill this out. You might want to fill it out for your own state or have a conversation with one another and fill it out collectively about where you see the common elements. But my guess is you may surface things that others won't. So why don't you fill that out, and we'll come back together in 10 minutes and process that. And then we'll close out with a reflection. Thanks. So a way to make sure the president's staying focused, but also the leadership team, but also making sure somebody wakes up every day thinking about it. The backbone of the initiative. And reminds leaders. So if any of you want, we can literally, if you have a board that's undergoing a search and you want a briefing on that, or you want to ship hard copies, we've got some printed out. I mean, if that will be useful for you, that's one way of thinking about it. So how can you engage them in ways of thinking about that before the moment? The problem at the moment is they're all going to do two things. They're going to hire a search firm, and then they're going to appoint a search committee. And the board is not going to have reflected on what they want and what the college needs based on the college's strengths and reform trajectory. So if you can get them engaged before that moment, it's best. But again, the political dynamic needs to be dealt with carefully. They're still blaming the student. We heard a little bit of that. What do? You have to activate the student voice. It really helps to activate. It's very hard to blame somebody who's telling you that something that you did caused their problem. It's also just hard to, there's all of this really terrific research that when you get to know people, it's really hard to demonize them. Right? In the racially polarized place where we are right now as a country, one of the problems is we all live in communities without connecting to other people. And there is really good research on this. It's hard to look somebody in the eye and demonize them if you know them. So activate the student voice. Again, think about, where do you see this in your work? We've just heard this. This is going to blow over, and the college or state will move on to the next thing. So part of the problem that we heard about with this is that it confuses people and there's initiative fatigue, but the other is that people blow over. You always have to repeat the message about why and what, using every possible vehicle. It really does help to repeat it. And over and over. You'll be tired of hearing yourself say it. You'll be tired of the message. You'll think it's too much. It's probably not. May not even be enough. The colleges are suffering from a failure to focus and from initiative fatigue. Got to maintain discipline over multiple years. Connect it to what exists. I love that answer. Again, really helpful. The colleges fail to engage external partners, so they don't have what they need to ensure student success. What does this mean? So we've heard of people building guided pathways that are designed for transfer, that still include lots of courses that don't transfer. Or they don't know if they transfer. Right? They rearranged they didn't engage the four-year colleges to build the four-year program maps. So ask where students are coming from, ask where they're going. What do students need? And then when you're asking what students need, and by the way, I think one of the challenges with guided pathways is that in execution, it sometimes doesn't consider non-academic supports that students need. I know this has been something that we're all aware of. I think in trying to provide those, one of the reasons colleges don't provide those is that they're not great at it, right? I don't know how to do childcare. I don't know how to provide for people who are homeless. They're starting to figure out how to do food pantries and single stop. There are some solutions, but there are some things that might not be within the college's core strengths or might not be efficiently delivered that need to be created in partnership, in fact, in seamless partnership with other entities. Leadership commitment and capacity is lacking at the institutional level. Again, we've talked a little bit about the three ways you can deal with that. But this may be the number one thing we heard of where the challenges are. Questions about scale, sustainability, and efficiency are not considered at the outset of initiatives. This is particularly true of the advising side of the house, that people don't ask these questions, right? There are questions that if you can train everybody to ask at the outset of initiatives, you can go a long way. You just have to ask them. How much is it per student? I don't know. Could we scale this if it works? How are we going to know if it works? Like these basic questions, and you've got to collect the baseline data. If you don't collect the baseline data, you're behind when you start the initiative. Other reasons. The job never gets done due to incomplete timelines for execution or evaluation. The answer is pretty clear. By when will we do it? Check-ins, accountability for timelines. Can't tell you the number of people. I just talked to a president of a large college, well-known, a good college, who said to me, I just realized our big problem. We don't follow through. But really, I mean, if we really reflect honestly. So here are some very specific things that we've learned about guided pathways. So one of the things about guided pathways, and especially those that are doing everything at once, is that everybody wants to be involved and does their own thing, and nobody's keeping track of how students are experiencing it. And so we've literally heard from colleges, in the first weeks after enrollment, students are saying, we heard 800 in 2 weeks, emails from different divisions and departments with no prioritization. If you send 800 emails, you're not sending any, right? So what do? I think it's really important. You can monitor a few students. Let them look at the emails that they're getting. Actually figure it out. But try to streamline those things. Again, always, because it's transformational change with lots of units in the institution, you got to keep track of how students are experiencing all of those things. And lots of change can take a little time to iron out. Expensive technology. Don't get Davis started on this. You probably already have. This is a major issue, which is that people haven't first figured out what their advising practices are going to be and the business models, and they buy expensive technology. And so there are ways of dealing with this. We actually did a technology adoption workshop through the Frontier Set with our colleagues here at Wyner. That was a good way of helping people figure out where their challenges might be. If folks are interested in that, we can certainly connect connect you with her, the ADA Center. She does a terrific job. Design and offer professional development, completely disconnected from college-wide student success goals. I can't tell you the number of colleges I've gone in to say, describe your professional development. It's very disciplinary, and it's very first come, first served. Right? Here's a pot of money. When it's gone, it's gone. And when people then think about how to enable it to have a college-wide impact, they say, well, people are going to come back and have a brown bag to report what they learned. Right? Sound familiar? So there's a real opportunity here to help people understand how to align professional development to the Guided Pathways goals. There's real work that needs to be done, leading conversations, how to evaluate. How do you set up a system of evaluation at the front end? I mean, there are some really important things that need to be done, and you have to centralize some portion of professional development to do that. And then I think this is one of the other things, and CCRC has been talking a fair amount about this, but investing in guided pathways reforms based only on what can be budgeted and accomplished in a single year. So this is a huge challenge that colleges have, which is they budget on a single year, but the guided pathways returns, just on a financial basis, putting aside returns to mission, meaning improved student success, happen over multiple years. And so really trying to engage in a multi-year budgeting process for student success reform that considers costs and benefits over several years. Short-term investments in advising reform and professional development are the things where you see the money being spent, sometimes technology as well. Long-term returns and improved retention and graduation. But you got to look at that in the long term, or you're going to always underinvest. So we have the curriculum, and we have other things that are coming. We're soon going to, you all know about the transfer assessment tool that we have. We're doing a similar one on labor market, how to align with employers. So these are some of the things that Aspen's doing. I really just want to close by talking about what's possible, because I think often we think about the sustainability of our efforts and the incremental nature of the efforts that we're engaged in. And this was the winner of the Aspen Prize, Lake Area Technical Institute, that has a 74% graduation plus 4-year transfer rate. It's a 67% 3-year graduation rate. And then another 7% of students who didn't finish transferred. A lot of those who did finish transferred too for a technical institute. Fascinating. We can talk about that another time. But this is what's possible. And that is, you enter a program of study, not the college, from the minute you enter, with no program choice after that. This is Guided Pathways in its purest form. It's a program of study that you enter. And to move is harder then, right? There are challenges with that. But they have a 74%. And people know what they're entering when they enter. That's the part of it. So I just want to highlight what's possible. And we've learned this from the Aspen Prize. And then this is San Jacinto College, which is a comprehensive institution in Texas with 40,000 students. And San Jacinto, these are from their IPEDS numbers. This is the full-time, first-time, 3-year graduation rate. And this is what we've seen in degree per 100 FTE, which captures part-time students. But they're really one of the stars in Guided Pathways implementation. And they've been doing work before that reflect Guided Pathways implementation. So in terms of improvement, they won our Rising Star Award this past year, along with Odessa College in Texas. And so I just really want to emphasize that this is fundamentally about students. And fundamentally, this is what's possible. And working in the way all of you have and are going to is absolutely essential to doing the work. All of the technical work that needs to be done, the strategic work that is in Guided Pathways, the math reforms I heard about earlier. I mean, so much of what you're doing will enable colleges to get here. In addition, you need committed and talented leaders who are supported in the work so that they feel as though, I don't remember who said it, I think Shauna, who said they can't feel like they're going to be punished. They have to feel like they're going to be supported. And you have a role to play in that too. So thank you for all the work you're doing and for sharing some time, and really consider this an invitation to let us know how the kinds of exercises you went through, the kinds of materials that we've developed might be helpful as you do your work. And we're really excited to see where you go in partnership. Thanks.